Sir Jacob and the king's party of 50 men had arrived at Warren's place. It was the largest city in the entire kingdom, and around its colossal arena were vendors and shops and restaurants of every kind. The arena was almost a temple to the people of the Middle Kingdom, and worshippers made their pilgrimage for their favorite events. Chariot racing was popular, and so was archery, but the largest crowd was always for the melee. People from across the kingdom, and even the world, would pack into the arena that towered a furlong above the city and covered 15 acres. The people at the top of the arena couldn't even see what was happening on the field, but they still felt like they were a part of it all, and they could cheer their favorite. As they entered the city, a large crowd gathered around them. He had thought for a moment that they were there to see the king, until the chants started. "Knight of Night! Knight of Night!" The king smirked at him. "They like you." Sir Jacob had won the last 3 tournaments in a row, and while he was in Linwood Keep guarding the king, he was becoming quite popular. The crowd stretched out a long ways, and the chants were nearly deafening. "Knight of Night! Knight of Night!" "At least trade is good here," the king mused, doing his best to shout over the crowd. "Well, why wouldn't he be liked, your majesty?" said Sir Frederick Thorncrest, an extremely handsome man, with his rugged, grey-streaked beard and thick head of hair. Sir Frederick served as one of the 5 knights of the King's Guard. "He's slain 200 men in a single night." Jacob smiled. "It's 200 now, is it?" He had no idea who had made up that number. The year before it was 100, and the year before that it was 30. He never bothered to count himself. They were riding up by a short shed connected to a small house. The king turned to him. "Well, come now, don't be rude to your fans. At least acknowledge them." He supposed he could. He jumped from his horse onto the top of the shed and skipped up to the roof of the house. His armor shone dark gray in the sun, and his crescent moon sigil on his breastplate twinkled in the light. He gave a small wave. "Love you all, fans," he made himself say. The crowd let out passionate cheers. Whistling and clapping filled the air, and they were throwing roses at him. Women were swooning at his gallant and beautiful appearance, his dark sparkling eyes, his pale, milky skin, his dark hair. The men cheered for his strength and prowess, and the legend that preceded him. When he decided that they had enough, he jumped back on his horse. "Imagine their disappointment when they find out you aren't competing," said the king, placing a hand over his brow, observing the crowd. There was really no reason to compete. He didn't need another one of those ugly vine crowns, that woven wreath that they gave champions. He already had 3. And being a knight of the King's Guard paid very well, so he didn't need the prize money, as much as it was. And there was nobody who could challenge him. The castle at Warren's place was attached to the side of the arena, and it was called Warren's Palace. Old Warren the White had built the castle thousands of years past, with just a small tertiary arena. But as the popularity of his games grew, expansions had to be made, and the arena had expanded so large that it dwarfed the castle. Jacob followed the king through the tall carved oaken doors of the castle, and Lady Alice was seated on her elaborate golden throne. Jacob thought that the red carpet was rolled out for the king, but he remembered that it was always there. Standing next to her was her gray-clad castellan. Jacob didn't know his name. His mustache and beard gave him a sinister look, but Jacob remembered him being kind enough.
"Why, your majesty, I am grateful that you have arrived safe."
She stood from her golden throne and walked down the red-carpeted steps to greet them, her bouncy golden hair bouncing, and her vibrant red gown flowing. Her castellan followed. She gave a curtsy.
"I hope all is well in Linwood?"
The king must have been looking for something, because he was moving his eyes all over the room. Yes, well enough, but not nearly as well as Warren's place, it seems. These events gather more and more people each year. And how are you, Lady Alice? How was your visit with your betrothed? Lady Alice seemed confused.
"Betrothed, your majesty? I apologize. I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning."
Now the king seemed confused. My son Prince Gerald came by, did he not? Please tell me he came to see his betrothed while he was here and didn't fool around in the city.
Oh, yes, Prince Gerald. He was here. But I am afraid I do not understand betrothed, your majesty, said Lady Alice as she stared off into the distance with her clueless, pale blue eyes, rubbing at her chin as though she was a wizard stroking his beard. I apologize, Lady Alice. Betrothed means you are to be married when you come of age, said the king. He was looking at her now, so he must have given up on looking for whatever it was. Lady Alice seemed surprised by that. Oh, we are to be married? Well, that's nice.
Nothing else was said of Gerald. The king walked to the castellan. And how have you been, Master Barlow? Oh yeah, Master Barlow. No, that wasn't his name. Rob Barlow? That sounded right. Master Barlow bowed. Splendidly, your majesty. Everything is in order for the melee tomorrow. We have your quarters prepared for you, as well as your host. Rise, the king told him. Thank you for your hard work. If you would, show me to my chambers. The long ride has left me weary, and I do not wish to be bothered by any lords seeking audience with me. Lords from every hold came to observe the tournament, too. Everyone liked this event, it seemed. Master Barlow walked the king to his chambers. I have heard of your son, His Royal Highness Prince Geoffrey, putting the dishonorable tax collectors in the underdungeon. Those haven't been used in decades, if I recall. The king seemed perplexed. Did he now? How does word travel faster than horses? Regardless, I suppose I misread his demeanor all this time. He seemed to me a soft boy. But my goodness, the underdungeon? Jacob had never heard of any sort of underdungeon, and he heard a little about tax collectors, but he had no clue what they were talking about. The king told Jacob that he didn't need 3 men to guard him in such a small room, and that he should go enjoy himself. Jacob didn't enjoy doing anything, though, but he figured he would walk around anyway. Maybe he could get a glimpse at the competitors this year. He figured he would visit the Griffins first. The Griffins were a sports team, to be sure, but they were also a political and religious order. They were called the Order of the Griffin, and they believed St. Lin's way was one of charity, responsibility, helping those in need, and social equality. They believed that he was a man who achieved sainthood, as opposed to their rivals, the Order of the Wyvern. The Wyverns believed St. Lin was an angelic being who bestowed royalty onto mankind to rule them, and that his way was one of honor and loyalty, innovation and development. It was little surprise what team the king favored. The Griffins feigned being a group of peace, but they had been found assassinating wyverns more often than the other way around. The Griffins believed themselves to be fighting for the common folk, the lowly and the poor, where the wyverns saw themselves fighting for their king, house, lands, and families. Both were fighting for their god. Each team thought the other were heretics. Jacob walked on the balcony above the Griffins, a stone walkway with columns that overlooked a large room with hay bales and swords, and a large flag of blue and white with the griffin on it, reared on its hind legs. He watched the way they trained, the way they held their swords, how they swung, their parries and ripostes. A griffin isn't winning this year by the looks of it. He went to the wyverns, a small courtyard where their banner of black and red with the wyvern roaring were placed on poles every couple yards apart. He watched the way they trained, the way they held their swords, how they swung, their parries and ripostes. A wyvern isn't winning this year. But someone had to win. He remembered the melee last year. A random commoner who was easily twice, if not thrice his age, had given him a good match. Or at least a match that had lasted longer than 2 minutes. That guy knew how to hold a sword so that it couldn't be slid from his hand, and he knew how to dodge. He wondered if that commoner would be at this year's tournament. Jacob himself was a commoner once, a base-born orphan. Other children were always giving him a thrashing, so he learned how to use a stick to defend himself against multiple opponents. That came in handy that night all those years ago. A group of marauders from the land of ice and fire had invaded a small hold in the south. Jacob was just a man-at-arms in the standing army at the time, 13 years of age, and he had been listening to his knight, Sir Adam Roth, tell him and his comrades a complicated plan that involved scaling a mountain, using rope, flanking, and some other nonsense. "Why don't we go and kill them all?" he asked. Everyone laughed at that. So he had gone alone in the middle of the night to the camp where the southern men were, and he began slaying them. It wasn't that hard. The men of ice and fire strength is in hiding and trickery, and they don't know how to use swords. If there were in fact 200 men, he didn't kill that many himself. When too many men are trying to hit a small target, mistakes are sure to happen. He remembered most had stabbed each other just trying to hit him. When you fought multiple opponents, they could only attack one or two at a time, otherwise they would hit each other. As long as you were better than them, you could win. The trick was in endurance. Once you beat one opponent, a fresh one would appear, and you were fatigued from battle. That was no problem for Jacob, though, since he had an almost unnatural stamina. His frame was smaller than most huge muscle-bound knights, so he didn't tire easily, and he was harder to hit. He had tried to keep a fire at his back so he could see them all, and so they would see the bright flames instead of him. He had escaped with a few nicks and scrapes, but his armor had absorbed most of the blows. Some tried to grapple him or push him into the fire, but he knew where a man kept his balance, and threw them into the flames instead. The stories were told that he went about, slaying men with his sword, throwing them over his head into bonfires. There were legends of Sir Jacob's strength, and that may have been true. If he needed to lift something, he didn't have too many problems, though he was unsure of how much was heavy and what that had to do with sword fighting anyway. Jacob rose early the next morning and waited for the king outside of his chambers. The king emerged wearing a blue doublet with a red trim, and red breeches with his sword in its scabbard. Sir Frederick complimented the king's outfit. "You are looking splendid, your majesty." He had trimmed his grey beard as well, and his head was just as bald as the day before. "Well, a king must look his best for an event such as this. The people must know that I value this event as much as they do." "I didn't know you valued this event," said Jacob. "I don't. Not that I dislike it. It is the crowd that annoys me. I wish they would just be quiet and let the men fight." Jacob couldn't argue with that. He and the other knights of the King's Guard ate with the king and Lady Alice and her castellan in the dining hall. They had eggs and bacon, a fluffy, flaky biscuit or cake, and some sort of fruit that Jacob hated. The tea was pleasant, though. Someone was missing, he felt, but he didn't quite know who. The preliminaries were starting. Hundreds of competitors were out attempting to qualify for the tournament. Small rings were set up throughout the arena ground, and spectators began to file into their seats. The king's seat was in the ladies' box, right up in the action, a dozen yards from the stage where the tournament would be taking place. It was an enclosure with an iron gate, wide enough to see through but thin enough to protect anyone inside from riots. It was raised a few yards above the ground, and there were steps to get to the roof, where Lady Alice would announce the beginnings and ends of events. Too much was going on, so Jacob couldn't tell if anything interesting was happening. Everyone was clanging their swords, or whatever weapon they were using. After an hour of that, they finally had the combatants, 32 in all. The first match was starting. Lady Alice climbed atop the ladies' box and spoke into her large horn.
"Welcome to this year's melee, everyone. We are ready to begin our first match of the tournament. Introducing first, representing the Order of the Griffin, Richard Allar!" A large group of men with stringed instruments played with bows came out, along with a choir of men and women, and they began playing and chanting. Then suddenly they were hitting the strings of their instruments with their bows, making a thum-thum sound, and their tempo increased. The choir's chanting was angelic. It made Jacob's blood rush. It felt so powerful. Out came Richard Allar, fully armored so that not even his face showed, holding the blue and white griffin banner. The crowd erupted in half cheers and half boos as he strutted to the ring. "And representing the Order of the Wyvern, Roland Ravskar!" "Ravskar?" said the king. "Really? Well, this will be fun." Jacob had never heard of any Ravskar, but he knew Richard Allar was just okay. On the opposite side of the arena from where Richard had come out, another group of men with drums and trumpets emerged.
They banged their drums, and the trumpets were loud and deep. It was an intimidating sound, one that gave Jacob goosebumps. It was almost frightening. Men with torches came out, at least 24 of them. Emerging from the dark hall was Roland Rovskar, a man with a sword with a ridiculously long handle. It was like a short spear, but it was a sword at the end. Jacob had never seen anything like it. Roland Rovskar had worn his banner as a cape, the black and red of the wyvern, and was clad in a mail hauberk and greaves, with a half-helm. The two stood across from each other at either corner of the ring. Lady Alice shouted, "Begin!" and they ran at each other. Jacob rolled his eyes. Roland kept Richard at a distance with his long-handled sword, but Richard sliced at it and went to the side. Richard went in for a thrust, but Roland dodged. Wow, someone who can dodge. Roland hit Richard in the head with the pommel and knocked him to the ground. Richard scurried to his feet, but Roland pursued him and caught him in the back of the neck, right in the gap between helm and cuirass. The proctor's hand raised. "Roland Rovskar of the Order of the Wyvern wins!" shouted Lady Alice. The crowd cheered and booed. Lady Alice walked down the steps into the ladies' box. "Isn't this exciting, Your Majesty? Just wait until the late rounds. That's when it gets good." The king leaned in his seat. If only their match had lasted as long as their entrance. "Who is that Rovskar fellow?" asked Jacob. He figured he would ask. "He's the son of Lord Raymond Rovskar, of Rovskar Hall in Wildern. I just never figured he would allow one of his sons to join a religious order from what I've observed of him. Not that he's irreligious, but he's come to me with talks of a senate like they have in the north. I hope he knew the Wyvern doctrine before letting his son join." Jacob figured that was an answer, though he understood little of it. Next was Horatius Tiber, a Wyvern, versus Lord Rupert. Tiber had gotten his raucous entrance music with horns and drums, while Lord Rupert simply walked to the ring in silence, with some cheers and no boos. They probably had no clue who he was, so there wasn't any reason to do either. "Lord Rupert?" laughed the king. Jacob had remembered young Lord Rupert from a while back when he sought audience with the king. He was not a very strong-looking man, and he was just 17 years of age, the same as Jacob. He wore a yellow gambeson and a mail coif, and bore a long, thin sword called an astok. His opponent was Horatius Tiber, a man with black hair that always seemed wet. He wore a black scale cuirass with the pattern of a red wyvern crawling around his body. He had a sword and a shield with the banner of the wyvern painted on it, black and red. When this match began, they measured each other before attacking. Good. Tiber raised his weapon high in the air for the strike, and Lord Rupert ran into him, close enough for a kiss, catching their guards together above their heads. Interesting. How could he strike from there? Tiber shoved him away with his shield and went for the same strike, and Lord Rupert ran into it once more. The same strike? Really? It didn't work the first time. What makes you think it would work the second? And it happened again, and again. No matter where the swing came from, Lord Rupert came in close and stopped it from following through. Before long, the heavily armed Tiber's strikes became slower and clumsier, while the lightly armored Lord Rupert remained nimble and quick. "Wow," said the king. Tiber had caught on, so he threw his shield and took his sword in both hands. He measured Lord Rupert, and they walked around each other, like a dance, back and forth. To the left, a quick jab. To the right, a feint. And with a quick thrust, Tiber was choking and on the ground. Lord Rupert had poked him right in the windpipe with his blunted blade, and Tiber was grabbing at his throat, coughing. "The winner is Lord Rupert!" shouted Lady Alice. Tiber stood, grasping at his throat, bowed, and shook Lord Rupert's hand. There were mostly cheers and some boos, probably from Team Loyalists who weren't interested in the doctrine. "Well, it looks like the Lord of Langspeak knows how to duel. His style is a bit unorthodox, but it works for him. You see that? How the wyvern bowed to him? The wyverns respect nobility. The griffins couldn't care less. The king was pointing and fidgeting, explaining everything, unasked. Lord Rupert's style wasn't necessarily unorthodox. He had just used a common shield technique with his sword. Jacob himself preferred to use a sword one-handed without a shield. It let his other hand open to do anything else he might need, like open a door or grab someone's hair. The next match was Wallace Gibson, a griffin who painted his face blue and white, and was lightly armored, but wielded a claymore. Jacob didn't understand having light armor but wielding a huge heavy weapon. His opponent was a young wyvern named Justin Basil. Basil really knew how to make an entrance, and even had a few words to say before the match. "Wallace, last time we fought, you turned the tables on me. You turned the tables in a wrong way. You got me mad now. Now I'm the one doing the challenging. I'm issuing a challenge to you, Wallace Gibson. Get in the ring with me. This time, I'm going full force." On occasion, a competitor would choose to address the crowd if they wished. Most warriors had enough dignity to let their steel speak for them, but some had become popular just for the charisma they displayed. Justin Basil likely would not be one of those. Wallace used his own charisma on Basil and near scared him half to death. Basil had somehow managed to qualify, but forfeit the second Wallace began shouting at him. Everyone booed at that. "Wallace Gibson of the Order of the Griffin is the winner!" The king turned to Jacob. "Keep score, Jacob." "No, why am I asking you?" "Sir Simon, keep score for me." Simon Baker was another knight of the King's Guard, a tall man with golden orange hair. "That's one for the wyverns, one for the griffins, and one unaffiliated. I need to know what I must prepare to say no to. This is what I like least about being king, giving audience to the winner of this game. They believe that if they fight well enough, I'll change my mind about how to rule the kingdom." I could have kept score. He couldn't have. He would have forgotten. He forgot what the red ones were called half the time. Who were the blue ones? The wyverns? No, the wyvern's the dragon. No, that's the griffin. Wait. No. The wyvern is the bird thing. He would have been no help. Simon Baker was smart. He would be good at it. Besides, the king wanted Jacob in the King's Guard because he was good at fighting, not because he was good at sums or reading. The next match was the wyvern Yor Eric versus a new griffin, Lu Bu. Yor Eric wore a half-helm that let his glorious golden mustache show, with studded armor and a long sword. He came out to the horns and drums of the wyvern. Then the choir began singing a more sinister tune. There were deep chants, with long-held notes, and the violins and cellos seemed to shriek as Lu Bu came out. He was a truly monstrous man, 2 heads taller than Yor Eric, who himself was big. He was probably just as large as the wyvern Hakon, but Lu Bu seemed like he was able to actually walk, and was also well built. His shoulders must have been 2 feet across. He wore black plate armor, with a helm that had 2 swept-back plumes, so he looked like a true griffin himself. He wielded an enormous glaive that was likely 3 yards tall. The proctor threw his hand, and Lady Alice shouted, "Begin!" Yor Eric was a braver man than most as he walked with confidence, sword raised towards the beast Lu Bu. Lu Bu didn't even have his weapon raised, but he kept it at his side, with his hand in front of him. Yor let out a shout, "Yeah!" as he charged at Lu Bu. Lu Bu used the back of his plate bracer to slap the sword aside, and he kicked Yor Eric square in the chest. Yor went flying backwards, sliding against the stone floor of the ring. He was undeterred. He rose and raised his sword. Lu Bu walked towards him slowly, and Yor was careful to circle around him so he wouldn't be knocked out of the ring. Lu Bu swung his glaive at Yor, who ducked underneath it and brought his blade upwards, but Lu Bu parried with the back end of his weapon, sending Yor reeling back. Jacob was actually impressed. Both of these competitors had skill. He remembered fighting the giant Hakon, and how easy it was to dismantle him. A swipe at his knees sent him to the ground. Hakon was taller than any man had any right to be, and the weight of such a massive frame made his joints weak. Lu Bu seemed to have no such problem. The way Yor was fighting, completely confident and unintimidated, as though he was fighting an equal, gave Jacob chills. Yor snuck under one of Lu Bu's swings and hit him in the leg. Lu Bu went to one knee, and was equal in height to his opponent now. Well, I guess I spoke too soon. Yor went to jab Lu Bu, but he dropped his glaive and grabbed the blunted sword in the air. He wrapped his fingers around Yor's neck and stood, holding him in the middle of the air one-handed. Yor was no small man, and must have weighed 18 stone. Lu Bu threw him to the ground and picked up his glaive. Yor stood and went for an upward jab, but Lu Bu parried with the end of his glaive and brought the blade down on Yor's shoulder. A loud crunch filled the arena, and the proctor raised his hand.
Lu Bu of the Order of the Griffin is the winner!
Lady Alice shouted. There were cheers and boos. I wonder how he fits indoors, wondered the king. They must make a special bed for him. I'm of around average height, and I fill my bed entirely lengthwise. Apparently the king was more impressed by the size of Lu Bu than the quality of the match. Yor could have won if he played the long game. He's probably used to being the bigger man in a fight. If he would have tried to wear Lu Bu down, he could have done what Lord Rupert did. A man of his size must tire easily. Next was Sock versus Armin Mills.
First, representing the Order of the Griffin, Sock!
Sock's music was just one horn blaring for a few seconds, then another, over a drum beat. He emerged and began flexing his sizable muscles. Sock wasn't a man of great stature, but he was as wide as he was tall, and all muscle. His hair and beard were white, with a small patch of black under his lip. He wore greaves and a mail coif without so much as a shirt, and was armed with a warhammer.
Next, representing the Order of the Wyvern, Armin Mills!
Armin Mills was a slightly plump man with a shaved head. He wore a breastplate and fought with a chain. Just a chain. He got the typical wyvern music. Sock had a few words to say before the match. He grabbed a horn and began to speak.
Armin! Armin, I just wanted to say that I gave you fair warning that I was going to hurt you. I see you shaking in your boots, and I gave you fair warning of what was going to happen. I can see you trembling, and I gave you fair warning to walk away. You want to listen to the cheers of the fans? You think you're a warrior, but you're just a fat son of a bitch.
The crowd erupted into cheers and boos. He threw the horn across the ring. The king was shaking his head. He's going to start a riot that way. Why did they let him speak?
Begin!
The two walked towards each other, both shouting profanities. Armin punched a chain-clad fist into Sock's face, but he didn't seem too hurt. Armin kept punching, and Sock was just standing, taking the blows, over and over, straight to his face. Suddenly, Sock dropped his hammer and grabbed Armin in a bear hug and flung him over the back of his head. Armin landed right on his neck, and the proctor raised his hand. Wow, that Sock is insanely tough. Sock wasn't a member of the Griffins last time, was he? He was from... where was it? Some eastern hold, said the king. Badgerfell, your majesty, said Sir Simon. The next match was your average fare. The handsome, black-haired wyvern Val the Sun defeated the griffin Barker Williams. Jacob was only half paying attention because there was nothing special about either one. The next match was starting. Lady Alice shouted into her horn.
First is Z!
Z? What sort of name is that? Wondered the king. Maybe it's a sort of alias. Sir Reginald Higgins went under an alias when I was a lad, and I believe there is a wyvern that goes by Edge. Z came out to no music or cheers. He was short, unarmored, black-haired and olive-skinned, with almond eyes. He wore a brown tunic and black breeches, and had a two-handed curved sword. No armor? At all? One good swipe will disqualify him. The proctor won't let it continue.
Next, representing the Wyverns, Galvar's son!
Galvar was handsome and tall, like his brother Vald. He was dressed like his brother and Horatius Tiber before him, the scale cuirass with the crawling wyvern.
Begin!
The proctor threw his hand, and Galvar walked confidently at his opponent. He grabbed his sword with both hands, and there was a foom! Z kicked his much taller opponent in the chin, and knocked him out in one blow. Galvar made a thud as he hit the ground. The crowd was silent, and Z left the ring. The proctor checked Galvar, and he was indeed knocked out. Jacob was speechless. The king was speechless. Lady Alice was speechless. The crowd was speechless. Then clapping filled the arena. What the hell was that? The king was amazed. Jacob had seen men knocked out with a single blow of a hammer or a club. But a kick? That intrigued him. Z hadn't even needed to use his weapon. I suppose a kick like that would have been difficult in armor. Lady Alice came down from the roof.
Did you see that? Incredible!
The king shook his head. You can color me impressed, said Sir Simon Baker. The next match was starting, so Lady Alice scurried back to the roof.
First up, Sir Frederick Thorncrest of the King's Guard!
Really? So that's who was missing from breakfast. I knew someone wasn't there. If I would have known, I just might have entered myself. But he remembered that he had sparred with all of the Knights of the King's Guard routinely, and had never lost. Sir Frederick was very good, though, so he would have a good gauge by which to measure the skill of the competitors.
Next, representing the Wyverns, Hakon!
Hakon lumbered out from the back, drums beating and horns blaring, and he could barely walk to the ring. His heavy plate armor made him even slower and clumsier than he already was. If Sir Frederick loses to Hakon, please kick him off the King's Guard, said Jacob. The king seemed to pay that no mind.
Begin!
Hakon hobbled over to Sir Frederick and swung his sword, but Sir Frederick slipped behind the blow and hit Hakon behind the knee. Yes, good. Hakon fell to his knees and lost his balance, falling face first onto the stone floor. The proctor probably should have raised his hand at that. Hakon went to stand, but Sir Frederick poked him with the end of his sword. The proctor raised his hand.
The winner is Sir Frederick Thorncrest!
Why did you doubt one of my trusted knights? Asked the king. I didn't. But if by chance he had lost, it would be an embarrassment to the entire kingdom, answered Jacob. The king chuckled. Like Hakon's an embarrassment to the Wyverns. Oh dear, what's the score now? 3 griffins, 2 wyverns, your majesty. Only 5? There must have been more than that. Oh yes, Z and Lord Rupert. They're unaffiliated. The next match ended with a griffin named Christopher Bennet being defeated by a northern prince named Edward Guevara. After that, the spear-wielding wyvern named Edge defeated the griffin named Tedric Rhodes. Next, the wyvern Roger Rovskar, brother of Rollin Rovskar, was defeated by a bald man named Steve Williams. After that match, Williams took the horn and said, I just kicked your ass! The crowd seemed to like him. Ronald Rovskar, a third wyvern Rovskar brother, defeated an unaffiliated commoner named Tom Horn. The next match began.
First, hailing from Hulig, Lauren Fossa!
A man wearing leathers emerged, with the skull of some massive animal on his head as a helm, and a large bushy beard. He pulled 2 trident-like daggers from his belt, and held one in each hand. Hulig? Win or lose, I may like to speak to this man, said the king. Jacob had never heard of a place called Hulig. His opponent was a griffin named Paris Justicar, and he had become quite popular among the common folk. Though the griffins supposedly believed in equality for all, they viewed Paris Justicar as a leader of sorts. He was an angular-faced young man with a gambeson and a rapier. He emerged holding the banner of the griffin high above his head, waving it and beckoning the crowd.
Begin!
They measured each other. A jab, a parry, left, right, forward, back. Each movement they made was met and countered. Paris jabbed. Lauren would catch it with his trident dagger. Lauren jabbed. Paris would keep him at length with his long blade. They went like that for 5 straight minutes, and Jacob was captured by it. This wasn't just a fight. It was a game of chess, being played by 2 opponents of equal strength. "Well, this is horrifically boring," said the king after the 10th minute. "Why aren't they hitting each other?" "They're looking for the other to make a mistake, while trying to not make any of their own." Suddenly, Paris went for a jab, and Lauren caught the blade with both daggers, locking it so it couldn't be drawn back. He spun around, taking a dagger away and jabbing Paris in the neck. The proctor raised his hand.
"The winner is Lauren Fossa!"
The 2 combatants shook hands and embraced for a moment, as a show of sportsmanship and respect for the other. Simon Baker raised a question. "Where is that Fossa man from, Your Majesty? I can't say I've ever heard of it." "Hulig, in the land of ice and fire." Jacob had heard that the land of ice and fire was a horrifically cold place at the bottom of the world. The people who lived there had no king, and they lived by hunting. Hunting bears, deer, wild cats, each other, whatever it took to survive. Supposedly they had a strange magic called pyromancy, but Jacob had never seen any magic. After that, the griffin named Hum defeated the wyvern Fork and Lamel. The wyvern Randall Cloud, who wielded an extremely large sword surprisingly nimbly, defeated a wizard named Bayo. Then another wyvern named Mark Isaac defeated the griffin Aaron Lothbar. With that, the first round was over. The king stood from his seat and stretched. "Finally, I'm starved. Where does the score sit now?" "It's 6 wyverns to 4 griffins, Your Majesty. The rest are unaffiliated." Then it was time for lunch. Welcome to the Storytime Saturday podcast. My name is TGD, and I'm your host this week and every week. So this was a very long chapter, an extremely long chapter. To be exact, this chapter is a little over 6,000 words, which is about the size of a chapter in the books I write now in my main series. So there's a lot to unpack. This chapter is very info heavy and very lore heavy. So if I really gloss over stuff, that's because stuff does appear later, and I'll go into stuff deeper as I can see it. So let's start talking about Sir Jacob. Immediately we see that Sir Jacob is a little socially awkward, and he's quite humble. He doesn't really know how to handle his fame. he kind of awkwardly hops up to the top of a house and is like, "Hello, fans," and then he doesn't really know what else to do. We see that he doesn't know how to handle his fame or the myth surrounding him as the Knight of Night, this legendary figure. We also see that he's not particularly intelligent or savvy on the ways of the world. Anytime the king starts talking about lofty matters, he gets confused and sort of just zones out. He interestingly remembers Gade, who is Gerald's bodyguard. He says he remembered the melee last year. A random commoner who was easily twice, if not thrice his age, had given him a good match. Or at least a match that had lasted longer than 2 minutes. That guy knew how to hold a sword so that it couldn't be slid from his hand. And he knew how to dodge. So that's cool. He remembers Gade. Out of all the fighters, he remembers Gade. So that's a bit of putting Gade over a little bit. He has Sir Jacob's respect. So Sir Jacob is low IQ. He has low conventional intelligence, but his fight IQ or fight sense in gaming, if you're playing a competitive game, you have something called game sense. They call this fight IQ, like in MMA and stuff. It's your understanding of angles and knowing what's going on. If I can tell you an anecdote. I was watching a knockout compilation of like UFC fights, and I was watching with Jordan, who is another character. Another character in this book is based on him, and he watches the guy. He stands for 1 second, and Jordan goes, "He's lining up for a kick," and then kick, boom! The opponent's head snaps back, and I was like, "How did you know he was going to do that?" He's like, "I don't know." He has a high fight IQ. So Jacob has a high fight IQ. He understands it's just intuitive to him. He has this freaky high endurance and agility, and he intuitively understands tactics. So he does things like keep a fire at his back at all times to keep his opponents blinded. And I think that's in the art of war, to attack with the sun at your back. He's also unnaturally strong. It's sort of hinted at that he's unnaturally strong. He never has any problem moving something. He doesn't think too much of it himself. He's like, well, I don't know what strength has to do with sword fighting. I like characters like this Sir Jacob character, that are hyper competent in one area, but debilitatingly inferior in another area. So that's kind of cool. Mandy from the previous series in the Storytime Saturday podcast, she's a lot the same way. She has a high fight IQ, but very impulsive and very unsociable. So it's interesting when he looks back, he's thinking about that his fame-making night. He remembers doing judo. He knows where a man keeps his balance, and he's able to use judo to throw people into the fire as they're trying to push him in. He can set them off balance and toss them into the fire instead. So we're getting a bit of a glimpse into Sir Jacob's actual skills, 'cause we've only seen legends about him so far. He's the Knight of Night, and we're told that he's a good fighter. Gade talks about how he's a good fighter, but we've never actually seen him fight. So we're getting pieces of his skill set a little at a time. Now, a good indication that we get to see his fight IQ is while he's watching the matches. He's watching the matches, and he's sort of giving a color commentary in his head. He's like, well, that guy made a mistake. He should have done this. And if I was there, I would have done this instead. Or why is he moving in like that? That's a strange way to move. So he's a color commentator in his head, like for the audience. So I actually think that's kind of clever that this guy with a high fight IQ is giving color commentary in his head as he's watching the tournament take place. We also learn that he's only 17. He's 17 years old. So that means he won the first tournament when he was 14 years old. He was the strongest fighter in the kingdom at 14. So that's pretty crazy. Now, there's a lot more to be said about Jacob. Especially the IRL Jacob that this Jacob is based on. I can only say for now, in the interest of time, since this is the longest one so far, Book Jacob is only like IRL Jacob in appearance, and that's it. So, IRL Jacob's not dumb. So let's talk about Lady Alice. Her name is spelled Aliss, because spelling Alice the right way isn't creative enough. Or something. I don't know. We see her relationship with Gerald is kind of weird. She's like, I'm gonna marry Gerald? Well, that's nice. And she doesn't really talk about what happened when Gerald was there. We see that she's kind of dumb and aloof. And kind of crazy. She has this microphone that she announces into. It's a horn that acts like a microphone to amplify her voice. And she's like giddy and excited watching people beat each other up. Now, we get to see some of the king in this chapter as well. As a matter of fact, the king is probably the most prominent character in the chapter. We see him engaging in his menial duties like offering greetings to people. He remarks, "The people must know that I value this event as much as they do." And when Jacob asks, "You do?" he goes, "No." So that's kind of funny. But he understands that his public image is important. So the people care about the tournament. So he's like, well, to relate to them, I have to be here and care about the tournament too. So he understands that his public image is important, and that he may need to bolster his public image. But he actually is a bit of a fan. And through him, we learn some lore about the competing factions, with him complaining about them, complaining about different lores and whatnot. And we get this sense that a lot of people come to him and bother him with really bad ideas. He says, people think that just because they win this tournament, they get to change my mind about how to rule a kingdom. So when he first arrives, he says, "Take me to the chambers. I don't want to talk to anyone. I don't want to talk to this and that lord." And he complains about the Ravskar asking about a senate, and he's mentally preparing himself. He's like, okay, whoever wins, I'm going to tell them no. Whatever they say, I'm going to say no. Now let's talk about some of the fighters quickly. I'm not going to go over each one, because honestly, a lot of these guys are just throwaways, especially the losers. But I want to point out Justin Basil quotes Jumpin' Jeff Farmer's famous promo verbatim. If you don't know, just look up Jumpin' Jeff Farmer promo on YouTube, and he quotes it verbatim. Now, Lou Boo, Loubaux, Lou Boo, is just a French spelling of Lou Boo, of Dynasty Warriors fame, Three Kingdoms and whatnot. And this guy is just a copy-paste of Dynasty Warriors Lou Boo. Yeah, he's basically completely identical to Lou Boo from Dynasty Warriors, so just a copy and paste. And Sock, this character Sock, you might get an indication from his description that he's not very tall, but he's stocky, he's wide, and he's built, and he's very tough. So he's a dwarf. He's this universe's version of a dwarf, really. He also has a hammer, and he's from Badgerfell, that is like a mining country. So that might not have been clear. Might not have clearly come through, but he is a dwarf. And he's also based on Scott Steiner. He literally is just Scott Steiner as a dwarf. If you don't know who Scott Steiner is, do yourself a favor and look up Scott Steiner promo on YouTube. So Sock takes a horn and he uses it like a microphone, like pro wrestlers do, like Scott Steiner does. And there is a slew of other pro wrestling references. Christopher Bennett being Chris Benoit, Edward Guevara being Eddie Guerrero, Edge is Edge, Tedrick Rhodes is Ted DiBiase and Dusty Rhodes, and Steve Williams is Stone Cold Steve Austin. We'll see some more of those people later, though. Now, at last, for characters, I want to point out this character, Z. Now, Z is also based on a friend of mine, and he makes quite an impact. He doesn't say anything, he shows up, kicks his opponent in the head, and leaves. So, there will be more of Z in the future, but that is supposed to stand out. You're like, oh, wow. It's supposed to stand out really above a lot of the rest of them. Now, some fun facts. Warren's Place, this entire tournament arc in truth, and Warren's Place itself is based on the Hippodrome from Constantinople. Now, George R.R. Martin, of course, borrows a lot from the real world, and this is, of course, as I've mentioned, this was called a glorified fan fiction. And honestly, yeah, it is. So I used a lot of George's, techniques, writing techniques, and patterns, creativity techniques, I suppose. So a lot of times George will go note for note, like along with history, and things play out in the book like they do IRL. So this entire tournament is heavily based on Justinian's trip to the Hippodrome. And if you know anything about that, I'm not going to spoil it, but so back then apparently there were a number of teams, or I guess they were called deems, and they had different colors. I think there were the blues and the greens. I think they were also red and white, but they were like integrated into the blues and greens later on. And not only were they sports teams, they were political parties and like guilds. I guess they would do like things like run the fire department and stuff. So there were these guilds, these political organizations that were also sports teams or supported sports teams or something like that. So that's where these wyverns and griffins come from. They're sports teams and political parties and religious organizations. So I thought that was super wacky and weird. I think even people that might have read this said, wow, that's weird. They're sports teams and religious orders. Why is that? That's weird. Because it happened in real life. That's why it's like that. Now, last, I want to leave you with a note that the ladies' box is described as an enclosure with an iron gate, wide enough to see through but thin enough to protect anyone inside from riots. Foreshadowing, perhaps? And if you don't want spoilers, don't look up the Nika riots. So that was this week's Storytime Saturday podcast. The longest one, I know. I'm not sure if the other tournament chapters are as long because the tournament pool shrinks every chapter. The tournament pool shrinks as we get to the top. Come back next time to see what happens in this tournament. Now, our next chapter doesn't go directly into the next part of the tournament. Next, we go back to Prince Gerald and his escapades. And I think this next chapter is one that I was particularly proud of. I'm like, wow, this is a good chapter. This is a fun chapter. And I sent it to someone. I said, okay, I think this is the best chapter in the book. And they said, wow, it's terrible. So come back next time. Check it out. See what's going on with Gerald. Thank you for being part of the Storytime Saturday podcast. It's great to have you here. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you like. If you're listening anywhere else, make sure you follow. Go to my YouTube channel, _Chalice, and subscribe. And go check out some of the other content on there. Gaming videos and miscellaneous videos. So I appreciate having you here. Appreciate having you here on the Storytime Saturday podcast. It's been fun, and I'll see you next week.